And welcome to this special edition of Houston Newsmakers. I call it special for a number of reasons. First, my guest is Judge Ed Emmett, former Harris County judge and now KPRC2's political analyst, among his many other responsibilities. We'll talk about that in a second. And second is our topic this morning, our democracy and the peril it seems to be in. You've probably seen it or felt it or heard it, whether it's in Congress or in Austin. Our political parties are polar opposites in so many ways. There seems to be very little room for progress on behalf of us. And the prospects for getting better in this category, not great, it seems. Judge Ed Emmett is a Republican, a fellow in energy and transportation at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. He's also my friend. I'm a hardcore political independent. He knows that by now. I'm also an optimist, which this time requires sage wisdom from someone like Judge Emmett. I need a couch. So I've talked to you about, we've talked a lot about this. Democracy, it seems to me it's in peril. Your thoughts?
Well, the country's always had divisions, but what has changed fundamentally, in my mind anyway, for over 100 years we had two political parties that were themselves diverse. It was hard to explain that to people in other countries, for example. But if you go back and look, the Democratic Party had a wide range of viewpoints, the Republican Party had a range of viewpoints. And probably the best example I can give, if you go back to 1972, George McGovern won the Democratic nomination for president, very liberal. But somebody else won 6 primaries that year, including Michigan, New Jersey, and Maryland, and that somebody else was George Wallace. So how could you have George Wallace, the arch conservative, and George McGovern, the liberal, in the same party? And the same was true on the Republican side. You had a liberal element and a more conservative element. And so the parties were forced to deal with compromise within themselves in order to put forth a candidate that could win. Since then, the two parties have become much more ideological, and we can get into those reasons later on. And some would say much more extreme, to where you've got maybe the 20% on the left and the 20% on the right, and the 60% in the middle are lost. And so the two parties yell at each other. They nominate candidates who yell at each other, and so the public chooses that divide, and we can get into that more later.
So let's talk about the Republican Party for a moment, because you are a Republican. You haven't disavowed that, or some have. You have not. But that party that used to be Law and Order Party now is attacking the Department of Justice in Congress, doing that. It's Ronald Reagan what's happened to that party, and that's one of the things you talk about in terms of the reflection of the lack of diversity sometimes even within on the party.
Well, there are so many examples you could give for both parties.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And the reason it's come about, I don't know if you want to go ahead and get into gerrymandering now, but gerrymandering and single issue politics have become dominant, and that's a problem. And when I say gerrymandering, where the courts have allowed districts to be drawn for political and racial purposes. But there's also this, you're supposed to have compact and contiguous districts, and we're far from that. We now have districts that string all over the place to achieve a political purpose. And as a result, the people running for those districts don't have to talk to the other side. Right. All they have to do is have to talk to their so-called base.
We've got a couple of graphics for a couple of the political districts, and this is 7th Congressional District, for example. There, Lizzie Fletcher's district, which it's been carved up to make room for the new district that Wesley Hunt is now. And there are other districts as well. Here's Congresswoman Jackson Lee's district. When you look at that, you say, wait a minute, what is that? That's just an example of one of them. You can look at another district that is Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia's district. It looks as chopped up. Now, we could use Troy Nell's district, which goes out to it's not chopped up. But here's Precinct 1, Harris County Commissioner.
Right.
Now, Harris County, you wouldn't think you would need that kind of skewing around, and that's what you talk about, that these things have kind of been made this way so that those who are in those positions, or in some cases to make sure that they protect others, they make it more difficult for some who are skewed all around like that.
Absolutely, and a lot of that goes back to the Voting Rights Act, which that could be a whole program about whether it's time to revise that or not. But take the Precinct 1 Commissioner, Commissioner Ellis. County commissioners do roads and parks and bridges. Shouldn't that be more geographic than based on the demographics of the population that you're trying to serve? And in his case, you've got to find a way to get his house in there. And of course, he lives in a very wealthy neighborhood. So how do you combine that with Acres Homes and these others? Somehow we've got to get the courts to go back and say districts need to be compact and contiguous, and then let the political chips fall where they may.
That is an idea that people have trotted out from time to time. Mm-hmm. It hasn't gained a lot of traction, and that's because the people who are in power are the ones who want to stay in power. Is that a pretty good analogy?
Oh, absolutely. But the only way it can work is if you go to a nonpartisan redistricting approach, whether you do it by a commission, but then how do you determine what's nonpartisan? But ultimately, I think it's got to come back to the courts enforcing compact and contiguous to make these districts reflect a geographical community of interest that they don't right now.
You talk about the fact that the districts are drawn in such a way that it makes it challenging that those people who are there, they don't have to compete with anybody except for the people within their primaries for the most part. But you also we talked off camera about the single issues sometimes that make a difference. And right now your concern is about a single issue that seems to be getting into all levels of politics.
Well, the issue of abortion. It came up really in the 80s for the most part. And you think about it, if you're running for sheriff, your position on abortion shouldn't have anything to do with whether or not you're qualified to be sheriff or tax assessor or even county commissioner. I mean, if you're in a legislative position where you might have to vote on that, that's fine. But both parties, if you look, have run people out that don't toe the line. The Republican Party, if you're not right to life, you have very little chance of winning a primary. In the Democratic Party, if you are right to life, if you're not pro-choice, you have very little chance of winning a primary, regardless of what you're running for. That makes absolutely no sense.
And you remember, you and I were both around, at least I was around, I don't want to put you in the same category with me, but I think it's probably
right.
Yeah. When abortion was not a political issue at all.
Right.
And in fact, some would say that some of the main organizations now that are really activists back then weren't even considering abortion as a part of the political landscape at all.
No, that's right. And like I said, it's now, years ago when I first became county judge, I was given a questionnaire to fill out by the party. And I looked at it and said, I'm not filling out this questionnaire, because it asked me about all kinds of issues that had nothing to do with being county judge. And I said, if you give me a questionnaire about the issues that a county judge confronts, fine. Same's true for all these other, I always mention sheriff. You want a sheriff that knows how to run a jail and knows how to do that job. That has nothing to do with an issue like abortion.
By the way, we're going to do Newsmakers Extra as well as the next segment, but we have a lot to talk about. Because of your positions on a lot of different things, you have not skewed far, far right like so many others who are Republicans, which would make you ripe to be called a Rhino, someone who's a Republican in name only, if you don't hew to the far right, or what some radio guy I was listening to that they call it grassroots as opposed to MAGA, that sort of thing in the Republican Party. Can you exist in that area?
No, I think politics is a pendulum and it will swing back. But what I find ironic, the term Rhino just infuriates me, because the people who are called Rhino inevitably seem to be people who have been Republicans their entire career. And the people calling them that are new to the party. So how can they say Republican in name only? Ronald Reagan would be a Rhino today. Now, you go back and look at his position on whether it's debt ceiling or any other issue. Oh, no, and we thought he was an arch conservative at the time.
Right.